Okay, this video we're going to simplify some square roots, and then we're going to multiply some square root expressions together. So, again, we talked about the square roots. These are your perfect squares: 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49. Now again, 1's a perfect square because 1 times itself equals 1. 2 times itself is 4, 3 times itself is 9, 4 times itself is 16, 5 times itself is 25, and so forth. Okay. Well, the first one's an easy one because square root of 36 is equal to an integer because it's a perfect square. So the square root of 36 equals 6. So you just put equals 6. Now 48 is not a perfect square. Okay, so the square root of 48 is actually irrational. It's some irrational number that just goes on forever. So what you do is you put IRR, and then you start dividing that. You're going to divide this square root up into multiple square roots. Square root times square root. Okay, so 48. You'd start 48 divided by 36 because it's pointless to take the 48 divided by numbers higher than 48 because we know that's not going to work. But we can divide it by numbers lower. Okay, but that's a decimal. That means 36 is not 48 is not divisible by 36. Divisible means it's got to come out to a solid whole number when you divide it. It can be divided whole. No, it's a decimal. Okay, 16 works, so you rewrite that as 16 and 3. Now, some of you are wondering, well, also, can't 48 be divided by 4 and get 12? You want to divide by the highest perfect square root possible. Okay, so 16 would be the highest one. Okay, 16 and 3. So put 16 and 3. Then you replace the square root of 16 with its equal, which is 4. Okay. So, coefficient 4, square root 3. Okay. Next one, square root of the number 20. Okay. So, 20 is not a perfect square. So, we know it's not because it's not on the list. There's no whole number times itself that's 20. So, we know that's going to be irrational. So, I break that up, and I go square root times square root. 20 divided by, and then we want to find the perfect square 20 divides by. So 20, we'd start with 16. That didn't work. 9 doesn't work. 4 is a winner, so put 4 and 5. Not 4 with 2. The square root of 4 is equal to 2, but for now we put that as 4, 5, because 4 times 5 is 20. Okay? So the square root of 4 becomes 2. So 2 square root of 5 is what this equals. Okay, square root of 7. Okay, 7's not a perfect square, so that's irrational. So we put divided by, and we put square root times square root. So 7, we'd start with 4. 4 doesn't work. 1, 7. Okay. Okay, so the square root of 7, 1 equals 1. You don't need, anytime 1 ends up as a coefficient, you don't put it. You just put the square root of 7. Okay, so that is prime. It doesn't change. Okay, if the only thing we can get as a coefficient is a 1, okay, we're not going to be doing that. Okay, square root of 75. 75 is not a perfect square, so that is irrational. So we put the division and then square root times square root. So 75. 75 divided by 64. Nope. 49. Nope. 36. Nope. 25 works, but you don't put 25 and 5. You put 25, 3. Because 25 times 3 is what's 75. It's like you're breaking this up. 25 times 3 is 75. And the square root of 25 turns into 5. So 5 coefficient square root of 3. Okay, the square root of 200, so we put a division sign after the 200 is not a perfect square. Okay, we know it is not. It's an irrational decimal. So I go 200 divided by 196 decimal, 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 decimal. Okay, so 102. Okay, so the square root of 100 is 10. So we have 10 square root 2. Okay. Alright, the square root of 50. So 50 is an irrational square root. So 50 divided by 49 obviously isn't going to work. I'm going to go to 36. No. 25. 25 works, so we put 25 with 2. So 25 times 2 is 50. Okay, so the square root of 25 turns into 5. And we have 5 square root 2. Okay. Okay, 16. This is not irrational. Okay, so I don't want to see the I when we don't have to divide because the square root of 16 equals integer 4. So you don't have a square root remainder left over when you divide. It's just 4. Okay, now you're going to see something different. We got 3 square root 2 times 5 square root 10. First off, you just need to simplify this. So basically the 3 in the square root of 2, that means times, times, times. So put times. Now here's what you're going to do. Now remember, when you have nothing but multiplication, multiplication's commutative, meaning you can multiply the factors in any order you want. So what I am going to write just on this first problem is I'm going to write 3 with 5, because those are both coefficient numbers. I'm just going to rewrite the order that I'm multiplying, times the square root of 2 times the square root of 10. And I'm not going to do that on every problem. I'm going to go right to this step. So then what I do, okay, is I take 3 times 5, that's 15. We can multiply these because those are both coefficients, so that's going to be 15. Then I'm going to put the square root next to it, and I'm going to take 2 times 10. That's going to be 20. Okay. Now, you need to simplify the square root of 20, okay, after you have multiplied the square root of 2 and the square root of 10, because basically what you're doing is you're taking 3 times 5, okay, and the square root of 2 times the square root of 10, and that would be the square root of 20, okay. So see what we do? Basically, I'm not going to write this every time because I know I can take the 3 times the 5 to get to 15, and the square root of 2 times the square root of 10 to get 20, okay. But you're not done. You need to simplify then the square root of 20, okay. So the square root of 20 is irrational because square root of 20, that's not a perfect square, okay. I don't see 20 on the perfect square list, so that means we're going to have to label that IRR and then divide. Now, bring that over here because this 15 just drops down, okay? So then I try to break up the square root of 20. Square root of 20, we know that that's irrational, okay? So we put divided by square root times square root. So 20, is it divisible by 16? No. Does it divide by 9? No. Does it divide by 4? You bet. So 4 and 5. So the square root of 4 turns into 2. Okay. So 2 square root of 5. But now what you need to do is replace this square root of 20 with 2 square root of 5. And then what I'm able to do now is take 15 times 2, and that's 30. Okay. and then square root of 5. Now it's simplified, because the square root of 5 can only be divided by 1, and then when it divides by 1, we don't use 1 as a coefficient, so it's just 30 square root of 5. That's the end. Okay? Alright, next problem. Now let's make this a little quicker, a little cleaner here. Okay? So, 7 times 2 is 14, and then just make your square root, and then you multiply the square root values, because all this is multiplication. Okay? So if it's all multiplication, think of this in 3 steps. You multiply the insides and the outsides. Okay? Basically, I'll write this over here. So step 1, multiply outsides and insides. That's what I just did there. Multiply the outsides and the insides. Then step 2, you simplify. Okay. Okay, so for 7 times 2 is 14, 5 times 15 is 75. Now you need to simplify the square root of 75. Okay. Now the square root of 75 is irrational. Okay, so you bring the square root of 75 over here. Because you know square root of 75, I'm not seeing it as a perfect square, so it has to be irrational. So you bring it over here. So that means divide by square root times square root. I want you doing it over here because you got to remember that the 14 is right here. Okay, so you got to carry down the 14 and then simplify whatever the square root of 75 turns into. Okay, we still have that 14 right there. So 75 divided by 64, nope. Divided by 49, nope. Divided by 36, nope. Divided by 25, yep, 25 and 3. So the square root of 25 is 5, okay? So we have coefficient 5, square root 3, but remember that has to be now put behind the 14 that I got. And then that's not simplified because now we're able to multiply the 14 and the 5, okay? 14 times 5 is 70, so 70 square root 3. Basically, you know you're done when you have a coefficient and a square root, and that square root needs to be in simplest form. See, don't write this next thing down, square root of 3. Square root of 3 is already in simplest form because the only thing you could divide it by is 1, okay? Because it's too small. So 3 divided by 1 is 3, the square root of 1 is 1, but we never use 1 as the coefficient, so I just put square root of 3. See, that's already in simplest form. Okay, next one. So all this is multiplication, so you multiply the insides, 5 times 3. 5, 3. 5 times 3 is 15. And then we multiply the insides, 5 times square root of 5, square root of 5, square root of 25. Now, this is going to be easy to simplify then because the square root of 25 is a perfect square, okay? It's 5, so we don't put IR, okay? We cross that out right there and just put 5. So it's 15 times 5. Anytime you have a perfect square, you don't label it IRR. You don't have to do any of the work over here. You just replace that with its perfect square, its value of 5, and then you need to take 15 times 5, and that's 75. So you don't have a remainder square root right there. It's just 75. Okay, next problem. Multiply the insides. 7 times 2 is, or the outsides first. 7 times 2 is 14. And then multiply your square root values, because all this is times. So we multiply the coefficient values, 7 times 2 to get 14. And then the square root of 8 times the square root of 2 to come up with 16. Now, this is not IRR, because 16 is a perfect square that equals 4. So if it's not irrational, cross it out and put 4. So we have 14 times 4, and then 14 times 4 would be 56. So there'd be no remainder square root in that problem.